Functional training. Some people love it, some people hate it. But if you're going to decide one or the other, we first have to decide what it actually is. And Mike and I are going to break that down in this episode. Check it out. Welcome to the Principles of Performance podcast, where we discuss how to optimize your health, fitness, and performance. Whether you are a coach, trainer, or clinician looking to become one of the top 1% in your field, or a fitness enthusiast looking to learn strategies of how to perform at your highest level and be your very best, we draw on decades of experience of working as coaches, consultants, and trainers to top industry professionals and elite performers, athletes, and teams all over the world. Your hosts, Eric DeGatti and Mike Perry, investigate and challenge the most popular coaching, training, nutrition, lifestyle, and recovery protocols, as well as bring on our friends and colleagues who are leaders in the fitness and performance industry to join us in the discussion. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, as well as stick around to the end to find out how you can get access to special resources, deals, and learning opportunities. Now, let's get to the show. And away we go. Here we are with the Principles of Performance podcast. I'm your host, Eric DeGatti, along with my friend and co-host, Mike Perry. And it has been a while since we've had just some me and you time, Mike. So we're overdue.
It's just the two of us. No, it's good, man. We're gonna kind of talk shop a little bit today. We don't have the opportunity to do this too often because usually we're picking the brains of other coaches, clinicians, you name it. So it's gonna be fun to talk some shop and talk about some of the things that are rattling through my head today. So
yeah, we're gonna take a deep dive into something that we are attached to for the better or worse, and that is functional training and what that means in 2025. And so what I mean by 2025 is we're gonna go through a little bit of the history with functional training, but let's start by even defining what that even means. So the first thing is, let's look at the Webster's Dictionary. Actually has 5 different definitions of what functional means. One is to be, of or connected with, being a function, whatever that means for you. The second is that it affects physiological or psychological functions, but not the organic structure. Third is that it's used to contribute to the development or maintenance of a larger whole. Fourth is that it is designed or developed chiefly from the point of view of use. And so that's where there's a lot of subjectivity into what we define as functional may not be what other people may define as functional. And then last but not least, are performing or able to perform a regular function. Now, again, what is that regular function? And so when we define functional, do you define a functional exercise based on what it is, or what it does and what the outcome is?
yeah, so and that's a great question, and I'm going to steal a line from our mentor. Function is the result of good training, good programming, and good decision making, right? So function is the result. And that's the way that I would actually look at function: is what is the result of your particular modality, whatever implement that you use. Functionality to me is more about, is what I'm doing able to move me in the right direction to result in positive adaptations? That's what functional training means to me.
Okay, so we're going to pick that apart, and we're going to go down some rabbit holes today talking about this. But before we do, let's give you a little bit of the history of kind of this quote unquote functional training and how it got labeled such. So if you go back pre-bodybuilding, right? And this is like pre-70s, when kind of Jack LaLanne and fitness got into the lexicon of the average person, right? Because before then it was a male dominant, mostly meathead type of things that you saw in gyms. But if you look at gyms going back then, even if you go back and watch pumping iron, right? A lot of that was free weight based, but type of things. They weren't all machine based things. And we're not going to define it by machine versus non-machine. But even going back further, if you go and just right now Google a picture of what a fitness facility looked like in the early 1900s, right? What you saw was Indian clubs, you saw climbing ropes, you saw kettlebells, you saw some sort of dumbbells, right? It was a lot of things that we would quote unquote call functional fitness now. Then what happens is bodybuilding becomes all the craze, and we can thank Arnold for a lot of that. And thank goodness, because it got a lot of people into fitness that otherwise wouldn't have. But then, as with anything that becomes popular, people are going to look for how they can make money within this. And so they say, okay, well, if you want to build bigger biceps, if I made a machine that just isolated and focused on your biceps, I can sell that for $4,000 for a piece of equipment. And then you're going to need a separate $4,000 piece of equipment that does your triceps and another one that does this. And so now gyms became not a training center, but really an equipment rental facility where you went in and can I pay a certain fee to use your equipment throughout that. And the one that then became is most people's connection to fitness was I'm just going to work down the row of machines. I'm going to do 3 sets of 10, and then I'm going to go on the other machines with the blinking lights that for to do my cardio for a half hour there, right? And so that's kind of what happened. And then you had this turn of the tide in the late 90s, right about when I got into training. And what you had was people were crossing over and dipping their toe into the waters with what they were doing in physical therapy and other disciplines, whether it was yoga, whether it was Feldenkrais, whether it was um, uh, Alexander technique, or it was things that were being done in physical therapy and said, hey, we can apply this into the fitness world. And you had early people like Vern Gambetta, and you had people like Gray Cook that you mentioned, and Mike Boyle. And now it starts this movement, and now, quote unquote, it gets labeled as functional training. This is different than bodybuilding. And so that became a thing. Then what happened as time went on, as trends do with fitness, functional became uncool, right? Just as like the clothes you wore in high school became uncool 10 years later. And then now, fast forward 20 years later, they're starting to come back, right? Just like a lot of things that the music, the clothing and everything starts to come back a little bit. And so we're in this interesting place in 2025 where we don't quite know what functional is. And we're not quite sure if it's cool or not.
Yeah, and to go back to, the earlier gyms and the early days when a lot of the power lifts and a lot of the compound lifts were part of the bodybuilding world. I mean, you can see plenty of videos of Arnold and those guys and Lou Ferrigno deadlifting and back squatting and doing a lot of those powerlifting type exercises. And now
Well, the
people can
irony is,
argue.
Mike, in the old bodybuilding competitions, you used to have to do a powerlifting meet the night before. So before you went on stage in your underwear, you had to do a powerlifting meet. And that's why, people like Franco Columbu is considered one of the strongest relative to body weight people ever. And so, yeah, there was a lot of fundamental deadlifts, squats, those sorts of things. 'Cause those guys were really strong.
Well, they'd also at that point, right? And you mentioned this earlier. You were talking about we're essentially renting machines. Look, it doesn't require a lot of skill to go hop on a curl machine and do bicep curls. It doesn't take a lot of skill to use a leg press. It doesn't take a lot of skill to use a pec deck, right? Yes, there's some nuances there, but I think one of the things that the machines sort of robbed from a couple generations was the fact that they were able to quote unquote get results, but they didn't necessarily acquire a skill at the same time. And you know, back squatting is a skill. Power cleaning is a skill. Granted, that's an Olympic lift. Deadlifting is a skill. So, it's almost like we had these sort of old school exercises like the power lifts and the barbell lifts. And then we kind of got away from it because people assumed that just getting strapped into a machine and doing those is going to, replace sort of the barbell. And I think what happened is you ended up getting these bodybuilders, and along with gear and everything else, you ended up getting these freaks of nature, but it didn't necessarily translate over to general physical preparedness and general fitness. And you had mentioned earlier, like Jack LaLanne, talk about fitness and feats of fitness. That guy did just about everything out there. I mean, he was swimming and he was pulling boats with his teeth. I mean, the guy was doing just about everything. And that is where I think the beauty of this whole entire sort of, 3 to 4 to 5 decades. I think the beauty of it is we've had glimmers and we've had glimpses of really really cool stuff, and then it went away, and then we had glimpses of really cool stuff and then it went away, and now we're just seeing this sort of hodgepodge of a combination of stuff. You've got pseudo power lifters, you've got pseudo machine guys, you've got functional bodybuilding, and then you've got the stuff that you were talking about in the 90s and the early 2000s where it was just AirX pads, Bosu balls, and body blades. So it's been fun to watch the evolution of it, because I mean I started strength training when I was 13 years old in my basement with a Sears, rubber bench press machine. So it's just been cool to see the evolution, but it's also cool to see that the basics never go out of style.
Well, don't hear what Mike's not saying. Just because it doesn't require skill to do a leg press or a bicep curl does not mean it does not have value, right? And so
100%.
now the next question is, if we have to label things as functional or non-functional, and I don't think it's a black and white binary thing you can have. And that's the problem is you had these people who wanted to create, as they do with most things, is they wanted to create camps. Either you were for it or against it. And it's like, why do I have to make that decision? Because there can be a meeting place between those two worlds where we can still get really good results. And it's really relative to what the outcome is. Going back to your point, is really function is relative to what the outcome is that you're looking for. And so why does it matter if it's functional or not? Why do we have to give it a label? And so the biggest thing I need to look at is to say, what is it that you are requiring of your physical being? What is the environment you are putting yourself into? And are we preparing you better for that environment? And so I have a very simple line. I say, look, if you train all the time and you still can't help me move a couch, your program sucks, right? So you've built a very specific physiological and physical adaptation that has taken away from your ability to be able to go about activities of daily living or be able to be robust in the environment that the world is providing for you. Now, if your world environment is sitting in front of a laptop all day and then you're going to watch Netflix at night, you don't need a lot of physical, biomotor abilities. But what we have to look at is for the person that wants to be able to go up and down the stairs pain free, wants to be able to open up the jar without a problem, that wants to be able to maybe go play golf, pickleball, basketball, whatever it may be. Understand that to have that dynamic physical ability, we have to look at our training and we have to look at it from the standpoint, is our training lending to that and adding to that and improving that, or is it taking away from? Now, I'll give you an example from my perspective, and I'd like to get yours. I'll look back in some of the mistakes I made in working with teams, right? Especially high school teams. Is that in the beginning, I was the militant, like, I know what training is and what it's going to take for us to be the most explosive, fast, robust football team on the field on Friday night or Saturday. And that doesn't necessarily include bicep curls. But guess what? Every 16 and 17-year-old kid wants to do is bicep curls. So I would, be the one on the soapbox saying bicep curls aren't going to win us championships. So guess what they would do? They would just, you know, tune me out and they'd go to LA Fitness or wherever the local gym was and they do bicep curls anyway. Then I realized, well, why don't I just incorporate in that program? Because if a couple sets of bicep curls that is going to get greater buy-in from my athletes completely negates the benefits of my program, well, my program sucks, right? And so adding that in doesn't necessarily negate all the other things. So like I said, it's not a binary thing, and where your entire program, to the extreme that Mike talked about, like what people had this vision, especially in the early 2000s, of what functional was. Functional was you're balanced standing on one foot on a Bosu ball, the other foot on an AirX pad, the other hand's got a body blade, the other one's, doing a valve slide while you're spinning, a medicine ball in your nose. Like those are circus tricks. That doesn't necessarily equate to what functional is. So I almost look at is your training functional, is to say, is it adding to or taking away from your ability to function in the environment that you're asking your body to be in.
No, absolutely. I mean, what are you asking of your body, and is your body ready for the stressors that we're going to place upon it? And you'll know rather quickly if your body is ready or not, because the results will come soon. And when I say the results, your body over time will start to, if it's not going well, we'll start with a whisper. And then eventually it's going to start yelling, right? So, one thing that you said a little bit earlier, you said, is it adding to or is it taking away? And I would actually add a third column. Is it not doing anything? Right? Because yes, it's going to add and yes, it's going to take away, but a lot of people are just going to the gym and it's not moving the needle because they're not choosing the right exercises, they're not choosing the right order, or they're not applying enough stress to actually facilitate an adaptation. You had mentioned earlier, the circus tricks, the Air X pads and the body blades and all this other stuff. The reason why I think a lot of people were gravitated towards that is because it was hard and because it was challenging. And because of that, they felt like it was good. A lot of people assume if it's hard, if it's challenging, it must be good. And I think we both know that that's not always the case, right? Now, there is a time and a place where you can use multiple positions and sort of add together certain types of exercises to, move the needle, excuse me, or combine exercises to move the needle in the right direction. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, a lot of these frilly things that people assumed were good, but if anything, it was just glorified clamshells looking a little bit differently.
Well, and then, going back, when I said that we kind of have this label or tag on us is, look, we're both lead instructors and part of the education team for a company called Functional Movement Systems. And we teach a functional movement screen. And so that in itself has gotten a lot of arrows shot at it. And when people understand where it came from is, we had this huge rise in popularity of functional training in late 90s, early 2000s. And all Gray Cook looked to do was to say, well, look, if you're going to call things functional and say this exercise is functional and this is not, what is your grading point? What is your scale or measure for that? And what he said was, look, there's fundamental movement patterns that we all do. And this is not unique to Gray's position. He took some of this from Shirley Sarman, and a lot of people had different systems where they looked at things where they took pretty much all the gross movement patterns we do and put them into buckets and said, you should at least hit a minimum ability within that. And that's really what the FMS is do you at least meet the minimum? We can argue over beer and peanuts all night what optimal is and what your maximum should be. But we should all kind of agree what the minimum should be, that you should at least be able to do this and do these fundamental movement skills. And that's really what the functional, quote unquote, movement screen was made to be. And so when we look for a scale or measure of what functional is, that's generic across the board, like all humans should be able to do this before we introduce challenge into them. And then there's specific measures as well that we can get into that aren't necessarily functional for everyone. But before we get into the specificity piece, we also look at it from the standpoint of do you meet a minimum? And we've taken that same approach with our belt system, right? Our belt system has a white belt, which is, can you even get into the positions and postures and shapes and range of motions that this movement is going to require? And if not, you may have a movement-based problem. Then do you at least have a minimum level of capacity? And we set those minimums not based on necessarily our opinion, but the opinion of some really smart people that we honor and trust. People like Chad Waterbury and Joe DeFranco and Dan John and Charles Poliquin, that we did a collective, research of what do they see as kind of the minimums for each respective pattern. But then once you've achieved that and you go onto our purple belt, you could take one of three routes because we don't know what your optimal is. And your optimal may not be adding more weight to the bar because it may not serve your ultimate goal. And so you may add resistance if more maximal strength is your goal. You may add tempo if more, speed or explosiveness or power is your goal. But then that third track is stability. And that would be almost like what we would call functional. But realize stability can be the demand for stability and control could be done by just changing body positions. It could be done by making something unilateral versus bilateral. It could be done by making it more multiplanar versus the traditional front and back sagittal plane. So there's lots of ways things become slightly more functional. And I think it's a continuum more than it is, like I said earlier, more than a black and white.
Absolutely. No, and I think to look at this stuff as either non-functional or functional is a bit foolish. And that's when context obviously plays a significant role. And we've had this conversation several times where if we were to get the top strength coaches in the world, they would probably agree on 90% of the same stuff. But it's best to argue, or I don't want to say it's best, but people would rather troll each other for that remaining 10% because it's a way to stir the pot and get followers and just get attention. But yeah, it's definitely not binary. And I think at the end of the day, like we've talked about, it's going to be that combination of what you feel is the best route for the individuals and or team that you are working with.
And this industry has always been, from the beginning, it's been a pick your guru industry. It's been, once I start learning some stuff, I'm going to pick that person that I'm going to latch onto, and whatever they say, that's gospel. And so being really, I'll steal a lot from Kelly Starrett. Being that savage generalist is being able to pull your best parts from each of these people. So, Al Vermeil is one of the most decorated strength coaches in history. He's I think one of the only coaches that's won championships in all three major sports. And I've seen him at seminars say, I would never have an athlete do a Turkish getup in my gym. He said, if you do a getup, you can get up and get out of here. Right? Literally, that was the quote. Meanwhile, someone that you've worked closely with, Pavel Tsatsouline, has basically been the person who brought the getup into the lexicon of fitness. Or who's wrong? How are you going to tell either one of them they're wrong? Right? Good luck with that.
good. Yeah, I was going to say, good luck telling either of those guys that you're wrong. But again, it goes to context, right? I mean, I think like anything, look at Strong First and Pavel and what those guys have done with kettlebell training and barbell training and body weight training, right? They have a systematic approach. They don't have a really big menu of exercises, but that's for a reason. You don't need a big menu. You just need the basics done well. And if you look at the entire curriculum, which is, obviously barbell, kettlebell, and your body weight, you're applying the same principles to those different modalities, if you will. But at the end of the day, you're just trying to get a result. But, the basics never go out of style. And for Strong First, the getup's a basic. Like the getup is one of the first things you learn, but you go into other gyms and like you said, people are going to be like, kettlebells are dumb or get-ups are dumb. So again, you just have to look at the situation. You have to look at the coach. But here's what I will say. Regardless of who you think your guru is, that was a mouthful, they don't have it all figured out. There's some really, really good, smart coaches out there that have done very, very well. And then there's other coaches out there that have done very, very well, doing very, very different things, following different paths. But what you'll notice is that the similarities are the principles and the order in which they do things. And that's, to me, those are the people that you want to follow, right? It's not the do it my way or the highway, but it's like, what are all these really, really smart people saying? And they're saying pretty much the same thing.
Now, here's what confounds things that wasn't here 20 years ago that we do have now is we have where the sport is exercise, right? We have CrossFit, we have High Rocks. And now, does that make the exercise that they are doing, does that label them as now functional? Which means we have to take a step back and say, are function and performance the same thing? And they're not. And this is one of the big things where, again, some of the haters who will come to me about the FMS and say, well, the FMS doesn't predict performance. And I'll say, you know what? You're 100% right.
You are correct, sir.
You are correct. And you know why? Because it was never intended to predict performance, right? That's like saying, my toaster is lousy for warming up my soup, right? Because it's not intended for that. So if we look at now where function crosses over and does blend, because again, it's more of a continuum than it is two complete yin and yang things. If we look at what function lends itself to performance, is someone who is quote unquote functional is someone who is robust. They have adaptability and resiliency. So I'll go back to Kelly Starrett. Someone who has great GPP, you can general physical preparedness, who has all these abilities that we're talking about, robustness, adaptability, resiliency. You could drop them in a lot of different situations. You can they can enter them in a 5K. You can put them in a CrossFit class. You can put them in a yoga class. You can have them do these different things, and they're not going to be ahead of the pack. They're not going to be the best in class in any of those things, but they're also not going to get destroyed by any of those things. They'll also survive it because they have that adaptability. Now, the more specific you get, the more you lose of that. And so with that, if you want to, and that's the cost of specificity. If you want to be a great cyclist, it's going to make you not as good of a runner. And a perfect example of that is Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong, from a running standpoint, is at the level of a really good, like high level college runner, but he's considered the greatest cyclist of all time. And so when we look at specificity, if we want to be really, really good in this uber niche, that means we're going to have to give away some of our function and some of these other things. And so if we look at the ultimate, thing where we always like to pit bodybuilding, quote unquote, bodybuilding type training, which we've already kind of hopefully somewhat disputed that the real early bodybuilders did what we might call functional today. And you want to pit that against quote unquote functional training. How much function do you need to go stand on stage in your underwear and make 3 turns and get into a couple poses? You don't need a whole lot of dynamic function. And the more time you spend working on some of those other things, it may take away from time you could have spent changing your physiology and structure for looking your best in your underwear on stage. And so that's specific. So when people talk about bodybuilding training versus functional training, I say, okay, are you talking real bodybuilding training, like on stage in your underwear with judges? Or are you talking like, I want to look good at the beach? And we had a good friend of mine, Vinny Galante, he's a pro bodybuilder, just competed in the Masters Olympia. Like, that's real bodybuilding training. I talked to Vinny about that. That's not like, hey, I want to look good at the beach this summer bodybuilding. That's different things. And so along that continuum, you don't have to be as specific the less it is there's a sport with trophies or money on the line. And so understand that this is a gradient as well when we look at performance and function and where that fits in.
Yeah, to your point, a lot of people confuse training for hypertrophy with training for bodybuilding, and they are very, very different. I have a bunch of athletes, and in the way that I program, they pack on muscle, but when they're packing on muscle, it's not just it's the entire body is getting bigger, stronger, faster as a unit. So for me, functionality, like for example, putting on 10 pounds for a young football player or lacrosse player or hockey player, any sport that requires impact, having extra muscle is functional so you can deliver hits, but also withstand hits. So we're not saying that putting muscle on is a bad thing, or even implementing some of those bodybuilding strategies is a bad thing, but you have to remember what the goal is. And if your goal is to be a better football player, hockey player, lacrosse player, baseball player, hypertrophy can be part of the program, but following a traditional bodybuilding split is not going to be the best direction for athletes.
Well, one of the definitions in Webster is designed or developed chiefly from the point of view of use. I have a joke. I made a post that say, our bicep curls functional. Yeah, it improves the function of me looking good in a t-shirt. Is that if that's the function that I need to have? And when we look at even when I would do movement screening on NFL players, I didn't have the same level of expectation for the offensive linemen that I did for the defensive backs and the wide receivers. Why? Because they're put in more dynamic environments and demands in terms of what their body is asking them to do in terms of position, shapes, postures, ranges of motion, as well as all the dynamics of movement. the lineman basically step right, step left, get in a fight for 5 seconds and go back in the huddle and do it again. And so I want to just make sure they have the minimum that their body's not getting in their own way, and so that they can also survive the training it takes to put on the extra mass that they need, and that training is not taking away from their function. And when we say function, their ability to go through just fundamental movement patterns without pain within a minimum range of movement. So now when we talk about movement, we then also have to delineate, are we looking at hardware, like what you talked about, like more like, and Dan John talked about this, more armor on your body, right? That's hardware. And then there's also software, right? There is a skill acquisition piece. There's actually a skill of strength. That's a good name. Write that down, Mike. I think.
That'd be a great name for a gym.
And so when we look at movement execution, so I've had people tell me like, "Oh, check out my program. I have this great functional program. We added a bunch of functional exercises." Well, I used to joke when we use the term corrective exercise, which we've moved away from, but like corrective exercise done incorrectly doesn't correct anything. Functional exercise that's done really shitty is just shitty exercise. And so it's also relevant to your ability to create good movement execution and to be able to acquire the skill. Because if we would always say when we do a movement intervention for anyone, so let's say they can't touch their toes, let's say they can't rotate well to one side, and we're going to do some sort of intervention to try to change that. What's the first goal of the exercise? It's not to change it. It's to create awareness. Wow, I can feel that. I don't rotate to the right as well as I do the left. And I can feel where I jam up and get stuck. And so creating that awareness is number one. And then can you then put them in a proprioceptively rich environment, which doesn't necessarily mean Bosu balls and body blades. It could be putting them in a half kneeling position or even in a sideline position and say, I want you to kind of grab hold of your thorax and ribs and try to pull them as far as you can away from the floor, and then see what it feels like on the other side. And then I need that more restricted side to feel like the other side so you can get that equaled out a little bit. So when we look at that, that's a matter of movement execution and skill acquisition. So if we don't have a quality control in what we're talking about, we could be talking about the same exercise. We could be talking about a single leg, whether you want to do a single leg box squat or just a single leg toe touch or a single leg air squat, whatever variation that we would deem quote unquote functional. Realize that there's again, if we're looking at the effect of it, the effect of it is going to be completely different based on your execution.
Trainers, listen up. If you're tired of losing clients, feeling burnt out, or just second guessing your programs, it's time to stop winging it. Join us for the Forever Client Formula Challenge, a free 3-day experience where we'll give you the exact blueprint of the top 1% of coaches so you can build loyalty, retention, and a thriving business. You'll learn how to clarify your vision, connect with clients, and build programs that scale. Spots are limited. Sign up now and start turning one-time clients into forever clients. Register now at foreverclientformula.com.
I had a quick note here, Eric, and I wanted to just step back quickly because you said something that was a really good point. And I'm going to paraphrase what you said. You said, most people want to train without their body getting in the way. And if you think about that thought process, right? If you are competing in a sport, doesn't matter what sport it is. If you move poorly and you don't have a good level of general physical preparedness, if you are competing against another person in competition, you're actually competing against two people. One, you're competing against your own body and the restrictions that your body has, and that's number one. And then you're going to be sort of fighting or competing with your opponent. So now you got two battles going on at once because a lot of people don't realize that their inability to move and to be quote unquote functional is actually one of the largest barriers to skill acquisition. And they don't realize that. They just think, well, if I can do this, 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 and this, it's a really good thing. But what people don't understand is that their choices and the way that they train themselves is actually creating a scenario where they don't have much of a buffer to move, because if they decide to drive that car and hit the rumble strips and go off road, they're going to hit things. So I think it's really important for people to understand that sometimes their body and what they're doing to their body is actually one of the reasons why they're having issues, because their body is actually getting in the way of their ability to acquire skill or perform certain movements.
And that goes back to, is it a hardware issue or a software issue? Now, from the software component, we got into this bad place, and I think that's where a lot of the rebound came, with the anti-functional crowd, was is we the misconception was we're doing these screens to look for problems so we can assign a bunch of corrective exercise, and we're looking to fix things all the time. And I think, we can partly be to blame for being part of that, but and at one time I probably did, look at things through a much smaller lens than I look through now. And but if you're going to look at things like that, you have to understand, how does movement actually happen? And really understanding and appreciating how we acquire movement skills, and going back to our neural developmental sequence, that, in the first 24 months, we learned the majority of the movement skills that we are now building off of to this day. And that starts with eye tracking and rolling and going up into quadruped, into half kneeling, and then beginning to sit up and stand and begin to have gait. And then once you get to that point, then you start to develop more biomotor abilities that we can run and jump and carry and climb. Now, if you skip any of those steps, because maybe you're the parent that you want your little Johnny or little Susie to be to brag to everybody on the swing set how you had them walking at 6 weeks. Well, you skipped some pretty big developmental milestones. And that's why your pediatrician will ask along the way for those first 24 months, are they hitting these marks? Those are minimums we were looking for them to hit. It's not optimal. They're not looking to pit you against another 18-month-old and who has the better deep squat. Just can they stand on their own? And so when we look at fitness, we always look at it from more of an objective number standpoint. And what's a good squat? Well, if I can put more weight on the bar than you, that's where I look at it, where we can argue that a really well executed front squat, regardless of the weight, that is indeed functional, because there's a beautiful and elegant synchronization and symphony of timing that's happening within all your joints and within your connective tissue and within the soft tissue and within your muscular and neuromuscular system. So now also, when we look at things and try to say, well, that's wrong and we should change it, we also understand that there's a lot of reasons why you can have some of these things. So a great example I have is just a client I had yesterday who's got some stiffness in his one side of his low back that's been somewhat recurring. And I have some things that I'll throw at it to alleviate it, but I know that I'm not fixing it, because when we're talking about, he said, well, where is this coming from? I said, well, that particular area often comes from when we hang on that side. So I see it with baseball players when they're just standing in between pitches where they lean on one hip, or the mom who carries the baby on the one hip. Or I said at your desk, if you're always leaning to one side, or if, let's say, your screen is off center to your right and you're always turned in one direction, or if when you're driving, you're in the car a lot, you're always leaning on one side. And so he came back a week later. He's like, I never realized that. He goes, I must have been doing this my whole life. I've been leaning on my right side all the time. Mm-hmm. I can throw a QLO stretch his way, for 30 seconds every single day. It's never going to undo that habit. And until he undoes that habit, that downline byproduct of that stiff QLO is always going to show up. And so we have to understand that the habit is what we're looking to build. And basically coaching, whether I'm teaching you a squat or teaching you how to swing a lacrosse stick, it's just developing a habit and creating a motor program. And sometimes we have to undo a poor motor program, which takes significantly longer. So the whole 10,000 hours or a certain number of reps that we think it takes, well, it depends on if there's even a pattern there to begin with. It depends on if there's a bad pattern you need to do. And then it depends on, do you have the mobility to even get into the positions and shapes to do that? Because without that mobility, you can't even create the proprioception needed to build that habit.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that, because a lot of people don't realize that the positions, the way that they sit, the way that they stand, the way that they sleep, plays a role in your current movement profile, and that can change day to day. So I always tell people, oh, I want to improve my posture. Should I sit up real tall, squeeze my shoulder blades back, and do some rows? I'm like, you can, but the first thing you need to do is just be aware of how you're sitting throughout the day. And everybody wants the magic exercise when it comes to posture, or what should I do? And I always tell them, look, just anytime you see yourself slouching forward or holding your breath, I want you to just try to sit up a little bit taller and just pay attention to when you're doing that. The first thing is the awareness, or just noticing it, right? But the body will change. SAID principle, specific adaptation on imposed demand. People that sit all day, they get rounded shoulders, a forward head posture, and people call that text neck or whatever. No, that's just the nervous system in the brain going, oh, you're going to sit a lot. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you better at sitting. So what happens is the body, along with gravity, starts to change, and tissues start to adapt, and your body gets you better at sitting. Now, if your goal is to get better at sitting, just sit a lot and you're going to get a great result. But no one's goal is to get better at sitting, right? So whatever you do, wherever you spend the most amount of time, your posture is going to follow suit. And your posture is going to be a reflection of where you spend the most amount of your time, from a posture, from a position, from a standing standpoint.
I wish I could remember who taught me this and who I could attribute it to. So since I can't remember, I'm just going to take credit for it. I always say that your body goes to one of two places: where you're strongest and where you spend the most time. Right.
Yep.
And so when we get you strong, that's why it's so imperative that we want to make sure that we get you into the good positions with that, and also make you aware of that. Now, when we do that, when we talk about a proprioceptively rich environment, it's where you're getting feedback, and basically we're giving you guardrails to stay within, to say, if this happens, you're doing it wrong. Okay. And to do it right, you need to make this happen, whatever that feedback may be. So whether it's using, like I love to use lines in the floor. So if you're squatting, I'd love to line you up where your nose and belly button are in line with that, a seam on the floor. Because if you're someone, let's say you had a previous lower body injury and you tend to shift away from that, because I rolled my right ankle a long time ago and now I shift left in my squat, by lining up my nose and belly button on that seam in the floor, it gives me feedback when I'm doing it right versus when I'm doing it wrong. That's not going to happen if I'm standing next to you whispering in your ear saying, don't shift right. It's going to only happen if I give you some sort of feedback tool, or even what we do with what we call reactive neuromuscular training, or RNT, is where we feed that flaw. Whereas if you're someone whose knees buckling in the squat, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to buckle your knees in even more. And so that way you become aware of it, and you have to now fight yourself out of it. But when we do that, one of the things that, unless we're doing a specific bodybuilding, for again, lack of a better thing, where I want to create specific tension in a specific area, I'm not doing that through using tighten, squeeze, brace, engage, any of those things, because that requires me to be part of the process for it to happen again, right? Meaning there's a difference in the skill that you acquire through coaching versus through a reflexive demonstration of it, right? Like I always joke to say, when I'm working with somebody on a field session, they say, should I feel my glutes when I'm coming out of a break? And I'm like, if you feel it, great. That's a great place to feel it. But don't think about that. Because if you're thinking, you're not going to be there with a, lacrosse stick in your hand while somebody's jabbing another stick in your ribs while you're trying to fight for a ball, and think, I got to squeeze my glutes now. This needs to be happening underneath, in the subconscious, to where this is all happening reflexively. So understand that they don't own it until they can demonstrate it reflexively, where it's uncoached, which is incredibly imperative for it to truly be functional. If not, it is something that they can only practice in your presence. And then they haven't really acquired a new movement skill that can then be transitioned into what we might call function.
Yeah. And I've heard you make this point on several occasions when we're doing movement demonstrations. And you say, where do you feel it? And the entire room is going to feel it in a different spot. Now, if you're doing, chest flies, well, you should probably feel it in your pecs, right? But there's going to be certain situations where people assume that certain muscles have to be working at a specific time and they need to feel stuff. Like, when I'm deadlifting, I'm not thinking, do I feel my hamstrings? Do I feel my glutes? I'm just thinking, all right, I need to zip up. I need to, really dial up my tension, and I need to move this weight as a unit. And if I'm thinking about my hamstrings or thinking about feeling certain muscles while I'm trying to execute that, it actually may change the way I approach, attacking that drill. And it may actually make it worse. Now, if you're saying, hey, Mike, we'll use deadlifter example. If I'm saying, hey, I want someone to do high hip RDLs, well, yeah, we're going for hammies on that. But if we're having someone do a trap bar deadlift, or we're having someone do a straight bar deadlift, as long as they're not feeling it anywhere in a painful scenario, I'm okay with that. So I think that's a big part of it, is the feel situation is everyone's going to feel it differently. So when you're teaching and coaching as a coach, you have to realize that not everyone's going to feel it the same way. Everyone's physiology and movement profile is going to be different. Therefore, they're going to feel it in different spots.
Now, I'm going to talk about unique movement profiles in a second, but what you're talking about also brings me back again to that conversation I had with my friend Vinny Galante, who's a bodybuilder, and we were talking about focus within certain exercises. And he was telling me how he changed his focus doing certain things in some of his arm training, as an example. And he said it took a lot of stress off his elbow in terms of making his movement as inefficient as possible. And for him, that is golden, because really what he wants to do is, if he can get the same amount of stress into his biceps, as an example, with using less weight, that's less mileage on his joints. And ultimately, what all he cares about is getting tension in the muscle. So the more inefficient he can be, the better it is. Where if you go on the other side of that continuum, 180 degrees opposite, I need my athletes to be as efficient as possible. And I don't want that tension being born in any one specific area. I want it spread out like the spokes on a bicycle wheel across the frame. And so it's just the same movement done with a very different approach, because of how our nervous system is going to interpret that focus and then create the execution. Now, the other thing, well, now let's go back to hardware. This is something that you're big on, and you've actually done some really good talks on this, where we talk about structure driving function, or the other way around. Okay, so structure driving function means that if we look at what is the perfect squat, and if we think we can coach the perfect squat, it doesn't exist, because of the lever lengths is going to be so different from someone's foot to their lower leg to their upper leg to their torso, that what your perfect squat may look like at 6'5" may look very, very different than mine at 5'6". And so talk a little bit about how you've kind of done that deep dive and looking into the orthokinematics of how lever lengths make a play on terms of what we should look at in terms of what is ideal from a movement and function standpoint, and how structure affects function.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always tell people we're looking to optimize your squat. We're looking to optimize your deadlift. And I also like to cue this, is the cue that I'm giving for you is your cue. It's not everyone else's cue. And that's a big part of coaching, right? Because there's general and specific. But let's talk about anthropometry for a second, because I'm a big nerd on that. One of my favorite photos that we use in our presentations, it's a picture of Muggsy Bogues and Manute Bol. And I don't know the height difference, but I know it's pretty drastic. Now, if you have both of those right next to you, do you think that their squat is going to look the same? And hopefully you say that the answer is no. But when you start diving into anthropometry and kinematics, you have to really understand how limb lengths, torso lengths, all that stuff play a role. Because if you don't, you're going to be training that client that has short tibias and long femurs, and you're going to be screaming chest up for the rest of their lives. And it's not going to happen, because they don't have the ability to maintain an upright vertical torso just because of their hardware, right? Just based off of those proportions, tibia, femur, and torso, right? Certain people are biased to do certain things or built to do certain things. As Pavel always jokes with me, he says, Mike, you're not really made to do anything. And I always laugh when he says that, because it's pretty true. I don't really have a build for that, but certain people are just going to have different builds. Like you look at really good squatters. A lot of the really good squatters out there have relatively equal tibia, femur. I don't want to say torso lengths. Torso is a lot longer, but if you see people with, relatively same femur length and tibia length, and they move well, you're going to see more of an upright torso. But you get a 6'5", basketball player, and his femurs are, 2.5 miles long. That there is no way that individual is going to get an upright squat unless we bring a bunch of props in and try to manufacture a way. But then, are we really doing what we're supposed to be doing with that individual? Are we trying to force them into a position or a shape and posture that their body's not acclimated to? Yes, maybe no, but it really depends on the outcome and what you're looking to do.
Now we go the opposite way. You're talking about where structure affects function, but understand function also impacts structure. I had this conversation at a workshop I was teaching last week where, we had one woman in the class where she would literally sit into a deep squat and take notes. And she sat, would sit there for the extended periods of time. And then another guy who's a pretty bulky guy says, I want to get to where I could do that. And I said, it's not going to happen. Like the whole thing, we should all squat like we were babies. Understand that is coming from habit. And then that habit has now created and changed that person's structure. The connective tissue, the soft tissue, all of that stuff has changed over time. And that's why when you see cultures who are doing a deep squat when they congregate, well, that's a habit that they've formed, and that and their structure has adapted to that. You can't just decide I'm going to do an 8-week program so I can squat like a baby. It doesn't work that way. And so you're going to be forcing some square pegs into round holes. I'll give you a couple examples of this. The one great example is when we had Dr. Christopher Ahmad on, who's the Yankees team doctor. And when you look at a X-ray of a throwing athlete's upper arm, of their humerus, you will actually see greater spiral density of the bone in the humerus on their throwing arm versus their non-throwing arm. The bone has adapted, and this is Wolff's law in science. Your bone and connective tissue has adapted to that stress. The other thing I remember Chris teaching me is that we develop layback, which is your ability to externally rotate. So if you bring your arm up to 90 degrees, like you're throwing a ball, and then bring your hand back to get your forearm as parallel to the ground in the opposite direction, that degree of layback, well, that's determined in our adolescence before all our joints are fully formed. And so if you don't create that layback as a kid and you decide, hey, at 45 years old, I want to start pitching, you're never going to get it. And if you do get it, it's going to be at the cost of something else, right? You're going to do it by creating probably some joint laxity. You're going to do it by creating some instability. And so that's where the structure is now adapted to it. And so even the structure within our joints, if you know how our joints create glide and movement against each other, and you know how it creates imbibition, where nutrients get into the joint by kind of squishing together, and where arthritis, everybody's, I'm going to take glucosamine and chondroitin and these things for it, but the nutrition of your joints comes from movement. And so there are certain portions of the joint surface that will basically die of malnutrition because you've never put them in that position where they can get the nutrients in. And so that's why elderly people have higher and higher toilet seats. And so we can't take them and just throw them into a deep squat to fix that, or assume that they're going to squat like a baby, as you'll hear. Their structure has adapted to their lack of movement. Your structure will adapt to specific types of movement. You talked about that text neck and having your head forward. You ever notice that people have that little lump just above C7 called a Dowager's hump? That's your body protectively laying down connective tissue to keep your head from falling off the front of your body. That's what that is. A bunion coming from that pressure of either shoes that are too tight or someone that pronates all the time, and that additional stress on the medial part of your big toe is what creates your body laying down extra tissue to create more surface area. So that's where we get these adaptations, and understand those adaptations may not necessarily be changeable at that point. And it's not a dysfunction at that point. It is now their new norm that you now have to work with it.
Yeah, and that reminds me, you mentioned something earlier about, when you get to the point of your development in adolescence, that experiencing those adaptations. No one starts throwing curveballs and breaking balls at 30, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, they're just not going to be like, I'm going to start doing that because their body hasn't adapted. And if you look at, and this is when it goes back to development, I don't want to hijack it too much, but when you look at windows of trainability, when it comes to development, like there's a reason why we have these specific windows of development. And there's a reason why we need to understand sort of that process, because we know based off of science and development that there are certain windows of adolescence and growth where you can particularly acquire certain biomotor abilities. I'm just looking at a little little chart right here. But if you look at like skill acquisition for males, right? Between 10 and 12 is where they really start to acquire some skill. Does that mean that they can't acquire it at 8? No, but that's the sweet spot. Same thing with sprinting, right? Kids, actually males, learn how to sprint and actually have a window of trainability at like 6 or 7. Now, that doesn't mean you have the permission to go strap a sled to your 6-year-old and run him around, but having him go out and run a lot is going to be a really good thing. So those windows of trainability that we experience when we're a kid is going to set the tone for how our body looks down the road, especially if we are in specific instances, like you had mentioned, in that layback position. I mean, I can still throw a baseball, but I grew up my whole life throwing. So for me, throwing a baseball, I'd have to warm up a little bit, isn't a bad thing. But I can guarantee you, if I asked 50 other 45-year-olds in my gym to throw a baseball, it wouldn't look like mine because they'd never developed that layback, or they never even threw a baseball to begin with.
And that goes again back to that structure and function. When we go through those developmental stages, so many people would come to me, think, oh, I'm this flexibility guru, and they say, oh, my 12 or 13-year-old can't even reach past their kneecaps because their hamstrings are like piano chords. And I'll be like, the last thing you probably want to do right now is stretch their hamstrings. And so looking at some of these things, not necessarily as a defect, but a feature, is to say the reason why they're so tight is because you're growing faster than your soft tissue can keep up with. And so what now, that tension though, when that's happening from a neurological standpoint, that's one of the best windows to develop speed. And so right now, I'm not looking at this as a downside. And I don't want, the last thing I want to do is take someone who can't control their body because they're waking up every morning with new body they can't control as it is, and then destabilize them more by stretching their hamstrings. I actually want to lean into it and say, this is an awesome window that we can develop some speed right now. And it will normalize as your body catches up and it starts to react to this. Now, hopefully what you're seeing is, we've been going for well over an hour here, is hopefully what you're seeing is this, is that the two quote unquote functional guys have never said to not do anything, and we've never said that you have to do something, right? Other than meet the minimums for your environment that you're going into. So if you're the asshole out there that says functional is bullshit, bench, squat, deadlift, clean, and that's all you need, then you're an idiot, right? But at the same time, Mike, do you have anything against any for those exercises?
Not at all. Big fan of those. It's just where and when and with whom do you use them?
And does it serve them for their environment, right? So to assume that we are anti-lifting, right? Some of the people that were some of the whipping boys of functional training do a lot of lifting, right? Mike Boyle gets shit every day on Twitter. If you go into NBSC, you're going to see a lot of racks and you see a lot of people lifting, right? He has some very definitive opinions on doing bilateral lower body exercises or doing certain things like that. But one of the first videos I got from Boyle was an Olympic lifting video, right? So if there's any message you take away from this, is that functional is not clearly defined. It is not binary, whether it's functional or non-functional. That it is a continuum, and that as Webster said, it is designed or developed chiefly from the point of view of use. And so with that, Mike, any closing thoughts on functional training?
No. And if you really want to rack your brain on functional training, you're going to probably have to listen to this episode quite a few times, because we threw a lot of stuff out there and we we challenged a lot of thought processes on. But at the end of the day, it's absolutely what you mentioned in that definition: designed or developed chiefly for the point of view of use. I mean, is it the right situation for the right environment? And that's really what it's all about.
And we only scratch the surface.
Yeah.
Right. Right. If we wanted to go really deep into the rabbit hole, we were fortunate enough that we were at Perform Better last week, and we had dinner with Gray Cook, who's one of the functional quote unquote gurus. And we look at the definition of affecting physiological or psychological functions, but not organic structure. We got into deep dives of how movement impacts sleep, movement impacts HRV, right? So we can go down a whole nother rabbit hole of the impacts of movement globally across systems, not just the musculoskeletal system, because we like to keep it in that container, but realize that nothing works in isolation, and that we are holistic beings, and that our chemistry, our mindset, and our movement all are intertwined. And so we could spend another 3 hours going down rabbit holes of stuff that we've talked about when it comes to function. But we wanted to just create this general concept of what it is, what it's not. It's not binary, and it's not just a thing. So I encourage you to take what we've talked about and take it and learn more. Challenge us, come back, write us a message on socials and say, look, I found something different, because I'm open to it. This is a almost 30-year exploration for me and for Mike as well. So understand that if you want to call us functional guys and you want to think that that's a bad label in some way, shape, or form, let's first decide on what that even is first before you can make sure it's good or bad. So with that, we want to thank you for listening, and this has been the Principles of Performance Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Principles of Performance Podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please be sure to give us a 5-star review on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to learn more about our courses and mentorship program, visit www.principlesofprogramdesign.com, where you can book a free strategy call with Mike and Eric to gain insight on how to achieve your potential. Also use the special discount code PRINCIPLESPODCAST10 to receive 10% off any of our live or online courses. We appreciate your attention and your commitment to be your very best.